I was standing in the hallway of Sunset Manor Nursing Home, clutching my suitcase with hands that had started trembling, not from age, but from rage, when I heard my daughter-in-law Jennifer whisper to my son Michael in that breathy, conspiratorial tone she used when she thought she was being clever. Finally. Now we can get the house appraised and start liquidating her assets. The inheritance lawyer said we should have everything transferred within 60 days if we move fast. They thought I was already in my room unpacking my few remaining possessions. They thought I couldn't hear them over the ambient noise of the nursing home, the shuffling walkers, the distant television programs, the soft conversations of visitors saying goodbye to relatives they deposited here like inconvenient luggage. They thought a lot of things that were about to prove devastatingly, catastrophically wrong. The hallway stretched before me like a gauntlet of institutional beige, punctuated by motivational posters about aging gracefully and hand sanitizer dispensers mounted at precise intervals. The smell was that particular nursing home cocktail of disinfectant, cafeteria food, and something indefinably sad that seemed to permeate the air conditioning system. I'd been standing there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to work up the courage to walk to my assigned room, room 247, according to the plastic bracelet they'd given me, like I was a patient in a hospital rather than a supposedly voluntary resident, when their conversation drifted clearly down the corridor. You see, Jennifer had been orchestrating this moment for 3 years, ever since my husband Daniel died and left me what she believed was a substantial inheritance worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000. She'd convinced Michael that I was becoming unsafe, living alone in the 4-bedroom colonial that Daniel and I had shared for 32 years, that my occasional forgetfulness about where I put my reading glasses or whether I'd already taken my blood pressure medication meant I needed professional care, that keeping me at home was selfish when I could get proper help in a facility designed for people with my needs. She'd found Sunset Manor, toured it without consulting me, spoken to the director about my condition, and presented it as the only viable option when I had what she called my little episode last month, which was actually just me getting dizzy from new blood pressure medication and sitting down heavily in my kitchen chair because the room had started spinning. The truth was, I wasn't unsafe. I wasn't declining. I wasn't having episodes. I was inconvenient. I was in the way of Jennifer's master plan to renovate my house, the house she and Michael had been eyeing since the day they got married 5 years ago, and turn it into their dream home with Daniel's life insurance money and what she assumed was my substantial inheritance from his estate. She'd spent months dropping hints about how outdated my kitchen was, with its original 1,960 seconds cabinets and avocado green appliances, how much potential the house had with its large rooms and established neighborhood, how it was too big for just one person rattling around in all that space. She'd measured my windows for new curtains without asking, taken photos of my living room for inspiration while I was grocery shopping, researched contractors who specialized in mid-century home renovations, and created what she called a vision board for the house's transformation. She'd already contacted contractors. I'd found their business cards tucked into my mail pile, with notes in Jennifer's handwriting about kitchen islands and bathroom renovations, and something called open concept living that apparently required removing most of the walls on the first floor. She'd priced flooring, lighting fixtures, and appliances. She'd subscribed to home renovation magazines and left them, strategically placed around my house, with pages folded down to mark articles about maximizing your investment in older homes and creating your forever home on a budget. What Jennifer didn't know, what I'd never told anyone in the family, was that the inheritance she was so eager to claim wasn't actually mine to give away. Not really. Not in the way she understood ownership. Daniel had been married before me. His first wife, Catherine, had died in a car accident 28 years ago, leaving behind a daughter named Lucy, who was just 8 years old when Daniel and I got married 2 years later. Lucy had been living with her maternal grandparents in Portland, Oregon since Catherine's death. And though Daniel paid child support faithfully and saw her during summers and holidays, she'd never been particularly close to our family. It wasn't anyone's fault. Really, she was dealing with the trauma of losing her mother. I was trying to figure out how to be a stepmother to a grieving child, and Daniel was navigating his own guilt about moving on with his life. When she turned 18, she'd made it clear she wanted to build her own life on the West Coast, and we'd respected that distance. She'd sent cards at Christmas, called on Daniel's birthday, maintained a polite but limited relationship with us that felt more like distant relatives than immediate family. When Daniel died 18 months ago, his will left everything to me: the house, the investment accounts, the life insurance money, all of it, with one crucial provision that his attorney had explained to me privately in a separate meeting after the main will reading. I had lifetime use of all assets, complete control over all decisions. But upon my death, everything would pass to Lucy as his surviving biological heir. The house, the investments, the insurance money, every penny, all of it, was essentially held in trust for Lucy. Though I had complete authority over it during my lifetime, Daniel had structured it this way to ensure Lucy would eventually receive her father's legacy. Even though we'd had little contact with her for over a decade, and she seemed perfectly content with our minimal relationship, Daniel's reasoning had been both practical and emotional. He'd felt guilty about not being a more present father to Lucy after Catherine's death. Guilty about how our marriage had essentially completed her displacement from his daily life. Guilty about the fact that she'd grown up feeling like an outsider to our family unit. The trust arrangement was his way of ensuring that his love for her and his desire to provide for her future would be honored, even if he'd never been good at expressing those feelings while he was alive. I'd never mentioned this arrangement to Michael and Jennifer. There'd never been a reason to. I was healthy, relatively young at 68, and planning to live in my house for many more years. I had no serious health issues beyond the typical concerns of aging, some arthritis in my hands, blood pressure medication, reading glasses, the occasional memory lapse that every person my age experiences. Lucy was building her own life as a marine biologist in Oregon, had gotten married to a man named David, who worked for the state environmental agency, and seemed perfectly content with our minimal contact and complete financial independence. The trust arrangement felt like a distant future concern, something that might matter in 10 or 15 years but had no bearing on my current life or decisions. But as I stood in that nursing home hallway, listening to Jennifer outline her detailed plans for liquidating my assets, I realized that keeping this information private had been a catastrophic mistake. They were proceeding under completely false assumptions, making elaborate plans and financial commitments based on an inheritance that would never materialize for them. Jennifer had already put my house on the market. I discovered the listing online 3 days ago, described as estate sale, motivated seller, quick possession available. She'd cleaned out my personal belongings while I was at what she'd called a routine medical appointment, but which had actually been the fraudulent cognitive assessment, boxed up my photographs and lifetime of accumulated possessions, and stored my furniture in a climate-controlled facility without asking me about any of it. The cruelty wasn't just in their deception, it was in how thoroughly and systematically they'd erased me from my own life while maintaining the fiction that they were helping me. Jennifer had convinced Michael that I was too confused to make my own decisions, too emotional about Daniel's death to handle the stress of managing my own affairs, too set in my ways to recognize when I needed help. She'd presented my normal grief over losing my husband of 30 years as evidence of cognitive decline. When I'd objected to their plans, when I'd said I wasn't ready to leave the home where I'd spent 3 decades building a life with Daniel, she'd scheduled me for a cognitive assessment with a doctor who'd spent exactly 15 minutes with me before declaring that I needed supportive care in a structured environment and that my family was very caring and responsible to arrange appropriate placement. The assessment had been a complete setup, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. Jennifer had coached the doctor beforehand, describing episodes of confusion that had never happened, falls that were completely fabricated, incidents of leaving burners on and forgetting important appointments that were pure fiction. She'd created a compelling narrative of progressive decline and imminent danger that justified everything they wanted to do. When I'd tried to correct the record during the appointment, to explain that I was managing fine and that her descriptions were inaccurate, Jennifer had patted my hand with that infuriating combination of affection and condescension and said gently to the doctor, "This is exactly what we were worried about. She's getting confused about what's real and what isn't." Yesterday, she insisted she'd never agreed to sell the house, even though we've been planning this move for months. That patronizing tone, that gentle dismissal of my reality, had been her primary weapon for months. Every time I'd questioned their decisions, every time I'd expressed reluctance about their plans, every time I'd asserted my right to make my own choices, Jennifer had deployed that same syrupy concern, followed by a rewriting of history. "Mom, you're getting confused again. We've talked about this multiple times. You agreed this was the best solution. Remember? We discussed how worried we were about you living alone in such a big house." She'd gaslight me about conversations that had never happened, decisions I'd never made, agreements I'd never given. She'd convinced Michael that my resistance to their plans was evidence of my deteriorating mental state, rather than completely rational objections to being railroaded into decisions I didn't want to make. And she'd done it all with such apparent love and concern that even I had begun to question whether I was remembering things correctly, whether my grief over Daniel's death had affected my judgment more than I realized. But I wasn't confused about the law. I wasn't confused about Daniel's will. I wasn't confused about the trust arrangement that made Lucy the ultimate beneficiary of everything Jennifer was trying to steal. And I certainly wasn't confused about what was about to happen when Lucy learned that strangers were trying to sell her inheritance out from under her. I'd been carrying Lucy's phone number in my wallet for years, written on a small card that Daniel had given me shortly before he died, when we'd updated our estate planning documents, just in case something happens to me and she needs to be contacted about the loot. "Trust," he'd said, and I'd understood that he meant in case something happened to me and she needed to be informed about her inheritance. I'd never imagined I'd need to call her because her inheritance was being stolen by people who didn't even know it existed. But life has a way of presenting scenarios that no amount of planning can anticipate. From my room at Sunset Manor, a pleasant enough space with a single bed covered in a floral bedspread that looked like it had been selected by committee, a small desk positioned under a window that faced the parking lot, and a bathroom barely large enough to accommodate a wheelchair, I called Lucy that evening after dinner. The dinner had been surprisingly good, actually. Some kind of chicken with vegetables and rice. But I'd barely been able to eat because my stomach was churning with anxiety about the conversation I needed to have. It had been almost 2 years since we'd spoken, and her voice was cautious and confused when she answered the phone. "Hello? Lucy, it's Helen, your father's wife. I'm sorry to call out of the blue like this, but there's something urgent you need to know about your father's will and your inheritance." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped, if she'd hung up on me, if she'd forgotten who I was entirely. Then Lucy's voice, careful and uncertain. "My inheritance? Helen, I don't understand. Dad left everything to you. I never expected anything from his estate. We talked about that at the funeral, remember? That's what everyone thinks, including my son and his wife, who are currently trying to sell your house and liquidate your inheritance because they believe it all belongs to me to give away. But your father set up a trust arrangement. I have lifetime use of all his assets, but they pass to you when I die. And right now, my son's wife is in the process of selling your house and planning to spend your inheritance money on renovations because she thinks she's inheriting everything when I'm gone." Another long silence, then Lucy's voice, sharper now with growing alarm. "Someone is trying to sell Dad's house? The house where I spent those summers when I was a kid? Where are you right now? What's happening?" I explained everything, the words tumbling out in a rush of relief at finally being able to tell someone the truth. The nursing home placement that had been orchestrated without my genuine consent, Jennifer's systematic manipulation and gaslighting, the cognitive assessment that had been designed from the beginning to declare me incompetent, the house listing I discovered online, the detailed plans to liquidate assets that weren't legally theirs to touch. I told her about the months of psychological manipulation, the way Jennifer had systematically undermined my confidence and autonomy, rewritten my reality to justify taking control of what she thought was my estate. I described how Jennifer had gradually isolated me from my friends by suggesting they were too demanding on my time and energy, how she'd convinced me to give up activities I enjoyed because they were too stressful for someone in my condition, how she'd moved into my house for 2 weeks after Daniel's funeral under the guise of helping me adjust, and had used that time to go through all my personal papers and financial documents. I explained how she'd found my spare house key and had been letting herself in to check on me at times when she knew I'd be out, how I'd come home to find things moved or missing and been told I was simply forgetting where I'd put them. Lucy listened without interrupting, and when I finished, her voice was cold with a kind of controlled fury I recognized from her father. "Helen, I'm flying out tomorrow morning. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't let them pressure you into any more decisions. I'm calling Dad's attorney first thing in the morning, and we're going to stop this immediately. Lucy, I need you to understand I never wanted to interfere with your life. I never expected you to have to deal with any of this. If I'd known what Jennifer was planning, if I'd had any idea she was capable of this level of manipulation and deception, I would have told you about the trust arrangement years ago. You didn't do anything wrong, Helen. My father trusted you to take care of his affairs, and you've been doing exactly that. But now someone is trying to steal from both of us, and that's absolutely not going to happen. Not while I'm alive to stop it." That night, I slept better than I had in months. For the first time since Daniel's death, since this nightmare with Jennifer had begun, I felt like I had an ally, someone who understood what was really happening and had both the legal standing and the resources to stop it. Someone who wasn't going to dismiss my concerns as confusion or emotional instability. Lucy arrived the next afternoon with Daniel's attorney, David Morrison, who I hadn't seen since the will reading 18 months ago. David was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady, unflappable competence that comes from decades of handling complex estate disputes, and he was visibly angry about what he'd learned from Lucy during their phone conversation that morning. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to apologize to you," he said as soon as we'd settled in the small conference room that Sunset Manor used for family meetings. "When we met after Daniel's death, I assumed you'd discuss the trust arrangement with your family when it became relevant. It never occurred to me that someone would attempt to liquidate the estate while you were still alive and legally competent. This is not just a civil matter, this constitutes serious criminal behavior." He'd brought copies of all the estate documents, including the detailed trust paperwork that clearly established Lucy as the ultimate beneficiary of Daniel's assets. More importantly, he'd brought documentation proving that neither Michael nor Jennifer had any legal authority whatsoever to make decisions about the estate, to sell property, or to commit me to institutional care without my explicit and informed consent. "The cognitive assessment that was used to justify your placement here," David explained, spreading documents across the conference table, "was never legally binding. No court was involved, no guardianship proceedings were initiated, no legal determination of incompetence was ever made. Your daughter-in-law has been operating completely without legal authority. She's essentially stolen your property and committed you to an institution based on a single doctor's opinion that was procured under fraudulent circumstances. Lucy sat beside me, holding my hand as David outlined our legal options. She looked so much like her father, the same intelligent dark eyes, the same determined set to her jaw when she was thinking through a complex problem, the same way of tilting her head slightly when she was listening intently. At 36, she was a successful professional with her own life and substantial resources, and she was bringing all of that capability to bear on this situation, with a focus that was both comforting and slightly intimidating. What we're going to do, David continued, is file for immediate injunctive relief to stop the house sale and freeze all estate assets. We're also going to demand a full accounting of any money that's already been spent or moved from your accounts, and we're going to file formal complaints with both the state medical board about the fraudulent cognitive assessment and with the district attorney's office about the elder abuse and financial exploitation. What? About the nursing home? I asked. Can I leave? Do I have to stay here? You can leave right now, today, this minute, David said firmly. You were never legally committed to this facility. You can walk out the front door whenever you choose. The only question is where you want to go and what kind of support you might need to resume your independent life. Lucy squeezed my hand and looked at me with an expression that was both hopeful and tentative. Helen, I'd like you to come stay with me in Oregon while we sort this legal mess out. I have a guest cottage on my property that would give you complete privacy and independence, but also support and company if you want it. And I'd really like to get to know you better. I realize I've been distant and formal since Dad died, and that wasn't fair to either of us. I looked at this young woman, this grown daughter of Daniel's who I'd barely known, but who had dropped everything in her life to protect both our interests, and felt something settle in my chest that had been tight and anxious for months. I would like that very much. The next morning, while I packed my few belongings from the nursing home, David and Lucy were busy systematically dismantling Jennifer's elaborate scheme. They'd obtained an emergency court order, freezing all estate assets and halting the house sale. They demanded that the real estate listing be removed immediately and that all potential buyers be notified that the sale was unauthorized and legally invalid. They'd also filed formal complaints against the doctor who'd conducted my fraudulent cognitive assessment, detailing the false information Jennifer had provided and the completely inadequate evaluation process that had rubber-stamped her desired outcome. But the most devastating move was yet to come. Lucy had spent the previous evening doing research on Jennifer, and what she discovered was both illuminating and horrifying. This wasn't Jennifer's first attempt at financial manipulation of elderly family members. Jennifer had convinced her own 78-year-old mother to sign over power of attorney 3 years ago, then had systematically drained her mother's savings account for what she claimed were necessary care expenses that were never properly documented or justified. When Jennifer's siblings had questioned the expenditures, Jennifer had used the same gaslighting tactics she'd used on me, suggesting that their mother was confused, that they were being selfish and unrealistic about the costs of elder care, that she was the only one responsible enough to handle their mother's affairs. The pattern was unmistakable and chilling. Jennifer systematically targeted vulnerable older adults, undermined their confidence and autonomy through psychological manipulation, positioned herself as their savior and primary caregiver, then robbed them blind while maintaining the fiction that she was acting in their best interests. Armed with this information and documentation of the pattern of abuse, David filed not just a civil complaint, but also a formal criminal referral for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud. Jennifer hadn't just made a mistake or acted impulsively. She'd committed multiple felonies with premeditation and careful planning. I was in my room at Sunset Manor, finishing my packing and preparing to check out, when Jennifer and Michael arrived for what they thought would be a routine visit to check on my adjustment to institutional life. I heard Jennifer's voice in the hallway, bright and cheerful, as she spoke to the nursing staff. "We're just checking on Mom, making sure she's settling in well and adjusting to the routine here. The house sale is progressing beautifully. We should have everything wrapped up and finalized within the month." They knocked on my door, and I invited them in with a calmness that surprised me. Jennifer was carrying a small bouquet of flowers, daisies, and carnations from the grocery store and wearing her most concerned and loving expression. Michael looked uncomfortable and slightly guilty, the way he always did when he was going along with something he wasn't entirely sure about but didn't want to question. "Hi, Mom," Jennifer said warmly, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We brought you some flowers to brighten up your room and make it feel more like home. How are you feeling today? Are you settling into the routine here okay?" I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had systematically destroyed my autonomy and planned to steal what she thought was my life's savings, and felt remarkably calm and clear-headed. "I'm feeling much better, actually. Clearer and more focused than I've felt in months." "That's wonderful to hear," Jennifer said, bustling around to arrange the flowers in the water glass on my nightstand. "See, I told you this place would be good for you. Sometimes we resist change, even when it's exactly what we need, even when it's in our best interest." "You're absolutely right about that," I said evenly. "I have been resisting some changes that are very much in my best interest, but I'm ready to embrace them now." Michael sat on the edge of my bed, looking genuinely concerned about my well-being. "What kind of changes are you talking about, Mom?" "Well, for starters, I'm leaving here today. I'm going to Oregon to stay with Lucy while some important legal matters get resolved." Jennifer's bright smile faltered slightly, and I saw a flash of something calculating in her eyes. "Lucy? Daniel's daughter from his first marriage? Mom, you haven't spoken to her in years. Don't you think this is all a bit sudden? Maybe you should discuss major decisions like this with your immediate family first." "I did discuss it with my family," I said calmly. "Lucy is my family. She's my stepdaughter and the primary beneficiary of Daniel's estate. And David Morrison, Daniel's attorney, has been very helpful in explaining some important details about the estate that I should have clarified with everyone much earlier." Now, Jennifer's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of confusion that didn't quite hide her growing alarm. "What kind of details?" I stood up and faced them both, feeling steadier and stronger than I had in months. "Details like the fact that Daniel's will establishes a trust with Lucy as the ultimate beneficiary of all assets. Details like the fact that the house you've put on the market doesn't belong to me. To sell it belongs to Lucy. Details like the fact that you've been operating completely without legal authority for months." The color drained from Jennifer's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Michael looked confused, glancing back and forth between us as if trying to understand what was happening. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Michael asked, his voice rising with confusion and concern. "Dad left everything to you. We were there at the will reading. We heard the attorney read the will. You heard part of the will," I corrected gently. "The part that gives me lifetime use and control of all assets. You didn't hear about the trust documentation that transfers everything to Lucy upon my death. Jennifer has been trying to steal an inheritance that was never mine to give away." Jennifer recovered quickly, switching to the patronizing tone that had become so familiar and so infuriating. "Mom, this is exactly what the doctor was concerned about. You're getting confused again about legal matters that are very complicated. We've been over this multiple times. Lucy has her own life and career. She's never shown any interest in your affairs or Daniel's estate. And the will clearly states that everything goes to you." "The will clearly states that I have lifetime use of the assets," I interrupted firmly. "But Jennifer, I'm very much alive, and I'm choosing to use those assets to live independently rather than subsidizing your kitchen renovation dreams." Michael was staring at Jennifer now, and I could see pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place in his mind. Jen, did you know about this trust arrangement? Did you know the estate ultimately goes to Lucy? Before Jennifer could answer, Lucy appeared in the doorway with David Morrison behind her, both of them carrying briefcases and looking like they meant business. Jennifer's face went completely white when she saw them. "Hello, Jennifer," Lucy said coolly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from knowing you hold all the legal cards. "I believe we need to have a conversation." David stepped forward, professional and unflappable. "Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Patterson, I'm David Morrison, Daniel's estate attorney. I have some documents here that I think will clarify the legal situation regarding the estate and the unauthorized attempted sale of trust property." Jennifer was backing toward the window now, her composure finally beginning to crack under the pressure. "This is ridiculous. Michael, your mother is having one of her episodes. We need to speak to her doctor about adjusting her medication or her treatment plan." "Actually," David said, producing a thick folder from his briefcase, "we need to speak to you about the fraudulent information you provided to that doctor, and about the criminal charges that are being filed for elder abuse and financial exploitation." The word criminal hit Jennifer like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward, reaching out to steady herself against the windowsill. "Criminal charges? This is insane. I was protecting her. I was making sure she got proper care and support." "You were stealing from her," Lucy said flatly, her voice cutting through Jennifer's protests like a knife. "And from me, you manipulated a cognitive assessment to have her declared incompetent, then tried to sell property that doesn't belong to you and never did. In Oregon, that's called theft in the first degree, and it's a felony." Michael was staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, his face a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. "Jen, is this true? Did you lie to the doctor about Mom's condition?" Jennifer's careful mask finally slipped completely. Gone was the syrupy concern, the gentle manipulation, the loving daughter-in-law routine. In its place was raw panic and desperate anger. "She's been sitting on a fortune while we struggle with our mortgage payments and student loan debt. She doesn't need a 4-bedroom house with a formal dining room and a finished basement. She doesn't need investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She's old, Michael. She's not going to live forever anyway. I was just being practical about the inevitable." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael was looking at his wife with complete horror, finally understanding the scope of what she'd done and how thoroughly she'd manipulated him into participating. Lucy was taking notes on everything Jennifer was saying, her expression carefully neutral. David was recording the entire conversation on his phone, capturing Jennifer's confession for use in legal proceedings. And I was watching the woman who had systematically destroyed my autonomy and tried to steal my stepdaughter's inheritance reveal her true nature to the son she'd manipulated into being her accomplice. "You lied to me," Michael said quietly, his voice heavy with hurt and betrayal. "You told me Mom was confused and declining. You told me she was unsafe living alone. You told me this was what she wanted." "She would have wanted it if she'd been thinking clearly," Jennifer snapped, her desperation making her cruel and reckless. "Instead of being selfish and clinging to things she doesn't need while her family struggles financially. It's not her property to be selfish with," Lucy said coldly. "It's mine, and you've been planning to steal it for years." David closed his folder and looked directly at Jennifer with the kind of professional disapproval that carries real weight. "Mrs. Patterson, you're being served with legal papers today. You're being sued for elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, and attempted theft. The district attorney's office will be contacting you shortly regarding criminal charges. And every penny you've spent from Mrs. Patterson's accounts will need to be repaid immediately, with interest and penalties." Jennifer looked wildly around the room, trapped and cornered like an animal. This is all a huge misunderstanding. Helen, tell them. Tell them you wanted to move here. Tell them you agreed to sell the house and simplify your life." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had tried to erase me from my own life while claiming to love and protect me, and felt nothing but profound sadness for my son who had been manipulated into participating in her systematic cruelty. "Jennifer," I said quietly, "I never agreed to any of this. You created an elaborate fiction about my mental state to justify stealing from me and my stepdaughter. You manipulated my son into believing I was incapable of making my own decisions. You had me committed to an institution based on lies you told to a doctor, and you tried to sell property that belongs to Lucy, not to me. I don't know what kind of person does that to their family, but I know exactly what kind of consequences those actions carry. The consequences were swift, comprehensive, and devastating. Within a week, the house sale was officially canceled and the real estate listing removed. Jennifer was served with both civil and criminal papers. Michael, after learning the full scope of his wife's manipulation and deception, moved out of their shared apartment and filed for legal separation. He came to see me before I left for Oregon, tears streaming down his face as he apologized for believing Jennifer's lies about my mental state and participating in her scheme. "Mom, I should have questioned what she was telling me about your condition. I should have talked to you directly instead of just accepting her version of events. I should have insisted on being present during your cognitive assessment. I let her convince me that I was protecting you when I was actually helping her destroy your life." I hugged my son, feeling genuinely sorry for him, despite everything that had happened. "Michael, she's extraordinarily skilled at manipulation. She studied my routines, my vulnerabilities, my relationship with grief over your father's death. She crafted a completely convincing narrative of decline and danger, and she presented herself as the solution to problems she was creating. Don't blame yourself for falling for a professional con artist. What happens now?" he asked, his voice small and lost. "Now I go to Oregon and get to know Lucy properly. I heal from this experience and figure out how to rebuild my life. You decide what kind of future you want to build without someone who would exploit vulnerable, elderly people for financial gain." And Jennifer faces the full legal consequences of her choices. Those consequences were more substantial than any of us had initially imagined. The criminal investigation revealed that Jennifer had indeed defrauded her own mother using identical tactics, and that there were potentially other elderly victims in her background. She was ultimately charged with elder abuse in 2 different jurisdictions: financial exploitation, fraud, attempted theft, and conspiracy. Her professional license as a physical therapist was immediately suspended, pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. The house they'd been living in, which was in her name from before their marriage, had to be sold to pay restitution to her victims and cover her legal expenses. But perhaps the most devastating consequence for Jennifer was the complete and total destruction of every meaningful relationship in her life. Michael filed for divorce once he understood the full scope of her manipulation and criminal behavior. Her own siblings completely cut contact when they learned about her systematic abuse of their mother. Her professional colleagues and friends distanced themselves when the charges became public knowledge and the local newspaper covered the story. Her mother, from whom she'd stolen nearly $50,000, pressed charges and testified against her in court. She'd gambled everything she actually had on a scheme to steal an inheritance that didn't exist, and she'd lost absolutely everything that was genuinely hers. As for me, I discovered something beautiful and unexpected in Oregon. Lucy's guest cottage was a small, perfectly appointed space overlooking the Pacific coast, with large windows that faced west toward the ocean, and a small garden that smelled like lavender and sea salt. Lucy worked as a marine biologist for the State Environmental Agency, and she was passionate about her research on coastal ecosystem restoration and climate change adaptation. We spent hours talking about her work, about her father, about the years we'd missed getting to know each other properly. I always thought you and Dad were happy in your own little world without me interfering, she admitted one evening, as we sat on her deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I didn't want to impose on your life together or make things complicated. Your father missed you terribly, I told her, feeling Daniel's presence strongly in this moment of connection with his daughter. He used to worry that we hadn't done enough to stay connected with you, that you felt displaced or unwanted when he married me. He set up the trust arrangement partly because he wanted to make sure you knew how much he loved you and valued you, even if he wasn't always good at expressing those feelings directly. We both cried that night, grieving together for Daniel and for all the years we'd spent as polite strangers when we could have been building a real family relationship. I stayed in Oregon for 8 months, and during that time, something remarkable and transformative happened. I realized I'd been living a constrained, diminished life long before Jennifer's manipulation began. I'd been so focused on being the perfect grieving widow, the accommodating mother-in-law, the woman who didn't cause trouble or make demands or assert inconvenient needs, that I'd forgotten who I was beyond those limiting roles. In Oregon, I remembered that I loved the ocean and had always dreamed of living near water. I remembered that I was interested in environmental conservation and had majored in biology before I got married and redirected my life towards supporting Daniel's career. I remembered that I enjoyed intellectual conversation, new experiences, and the company of people who shared my interests rather than just my family obligations. Lucy introduced me to her friends, her colleagues, her world of scientific research and environmental activism. I volunteered at the Marine Sanctuary, where she conducted her research. I took art classes in the nearby coastal town. I joined a book club that read everything from contemporary fiction to scientific memoirs. I started dating a kind, intelligent man named Frank, who was a retired environmental science professor and who made me laugh with his dry sense of humor and his stories about decades of teaching college students. Most importantly, I established a genuine adult relationship with Lucy built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than obligation or guilt. She was brilliant, passionate about her work, deeply committed to environmental protection, and possessed of a quiet strength that reminded me powerfully of her father. When I finally returned to my house, Lucy's house, our house, 10 months later, it felt completely different. I'd had it professionally cleaned and redecorated during my time in Oregon, removing all the furniture and belongings that Jennifer had boxed up and stored, and restoring it to reflect my own tastes and preferences rather than what I thought was expected of a woman my age. The avocado green kitchen, appliances that Jennifer had mocked, were replaced with modern stainless steel. The formal dining room that she'd called wasted space became a bright office where I could manage my volunteer work and correspondence. The basement that she'd wanted to convert into a media room became Lucy's laboratory space for when she visited to conduct research on East Coast marine ecosystems. I planted a garden like Lucy's, filled with native plants that attracted birds and butterflies and required minimal maintenance. I bought furniture that I actually liked rather than pieces that were practical or appropriate. I hung artwork that spoke to me rather than generic landscapes that matched the color scheme. For the first time in my adult life, I created a living space that reflected who I was rather than who I thought I should be. Most importantly, I began hosting regular gatherings for Lucy's colleagues who were working on environmental research projects up and down the East Coast. The house that Jennifer had seen as an asset to be liquidated became a hub for sustainability research and coastal conservation work. Scientists and graduate students stayed in the guest rooms when they were conducting fieldwork in the area. I organized fundraising dinners for marine conservation organizations. I learned about ocean acidification and plastic pollution and climate change impacts on coastal ecosystems, and I found myself genuinely passionate about work that felt meaningful and important. Michael visited occasionally, still slowly rebuilding his life after his divorce from Jennifer. He was in intensive therapy, working through his guilt about participating in Jennifer's scheme and learning to recognize and resist manipulation in relationships. We had developed a good, honest relationship built on mutual respect and accountability, rather than the manipulation and power dynamics that Jennifer had fostered. He'd taken a job with a nonprofit organization working on affordable housing, and he seemed to be finding his way toward a life that reflected his own values rather than someone else's ambitions. "I keep thinking about how thoroughly she fooled me," he told me during one of his visits. "How she convinced me that everything she was doing was out of love and concern for you. I was so focused on being a good son and supporting what I thought were your needs that I never questioned whether her version of events made sense." "She's extraordinarily skilled at creating believable narratives," I told him. "She studies people's vulnerabilities and tells them exactly what they need to hear to go along with her plans. The fact that you trusted someone you loved doesn't make you stupid, it makes you human." As for Jennifer, her consequences continued to multiply long after the initial legal proceedings. She served 22 months in prison for elder abuse and financial exploitation across 2 jurisdictions. After her release, she was required to complete 5 years of probation, with strict conditions about contact with elderly or vulnerable adults. Her physical therapy license was permanently revoked, making it impossible for her to work in her chosen profession. The house they'd shared had to be sold to pay restitution to her victims, and she was left with substantial debt from legal fees and court-ordered payments. When she got out of prison, she moved to another state to try to rebuild her life away from the community where her crimes had become public knowledge. I heard through Michael that she was working in retail and living in a small studio apartment, a dramatic fall from the life of comfort and status she'd tried to steal from Lucy and me. She'd attempted to contact Michael several times, trying to convince him that she'd been unfairly prosecuted and that her actions had been misunderstood. He'd blocked her communications and maintained strict no-contact boundaries on the advice of his therapist. But mostly, I didn't think about Jennifer anymore. When I did, I felt sadness rather than anger. Sadness for someone who had been so focused on material gain and social status that she'd destroyed every relationship that mattered. Sadness for the person she might have been if she'd chosen honesty and genuine care over manipulation and theft. Instead, I focused on the rich, fulfilling life I was building. At 70, I was more independent, confident, and purposeful than I'd ever been. I had a genuine, loving relationship with my stepdaughter that enriched both our lives. I had a romantic partnership with Frank that was based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine affection, rather than convention or convenience. I had friendships built on common passions for environmental conservation and intellectual curiosity, rather than just family obligation or geographic proximity. The inheritance that Jennifer had tried to steal was still growing, invested wisely, and managed with Lucy's input and expertise. But more importantly, the inheritance of love, wisdom, and resilience that Daniel had really left us, the foundation for Lucy's and my relationship, the strength to stand up to exploitation, the knowledge that we deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, was something no one could steal or manipulate or destroy. Lucy visited frequently, bringing colleagues and friends who were working on marine conservation projects. We'd converted the formal living room that Jennifer had wanted to open up into a comfortable conference space where researchers could present their findings and collaborate on new projects. The house became a gathering place for people who were passionate about protecting the environment that Daniel had loved, and I found deep satisfaction in knowing that his legacy was supporting work he would have valued. During one of these gatherings, as I watched Lucy present her research on sea level rise impacts to a room full of engaged scientists and advocates, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed. 2 years ago, I'd been a grieving widow, allowing my daughter-in-law to systematically undermine my autonomy and steal my future. Now, I was a confident woman, contributing to meaningful work, surrounded by people who valued my intelligence and respected my choices. You know, Frank said to me later that evening as we cleaned up after the presentation, watching you with Lucy and her colleagues, seeing how passionate you get about the conservation work, it's like you've found your true calling at an age when most people are winding down. He was right. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was living authentically, rather than performing a role that others expected of me. I wasn't trying to be the perfect widow or the accommodating mother-in-law or the woman who didn't cause trouble. I was just being myself, someone who cared about the ocean, who enjoyed learning new things, who had opinions worth sharing and resources worth contributing to causes that mattered. Sometimes people asked me if I regretted not telling Michael and Jennifer about the trust arrangement earlier, if being more transparent about the estate structure might have prevented the entire ordeal. I'd thought about this question extensively, and my answer was always the same. Jennifer's behavior revealed her character, not her circumstances. Someone who would manipulate a cognitive assessment to declare an elderly woman incompetent, who would lie to doctors and commit someone to an institution against their will, who would systematically gaslight and psychologically abuse their way into controlling another person's life. That person would have found other ways to exploit and control, regardless of what they knew about inheritance law. The experience had taught me that keeping peace at the expense of truth isn't actually peaceful. It's vulnerable. That vulnerability can be exploited by people who mistake kindness for weakness, generosity for stupidity, and love for leverage. I'd learned that my voice mattered, that my autonomy had value, and that my family consisted of the people who loved and respected me, not necessarily the people who shared my DNA or legal relationships. One evening, as Lucy and I sat on the deck watching the sunset over the water, we'd had a deck built overlooking the small pond behind the house. Inspired by her Oregon cottage, she brought up something that had been on both our minds. "Helen, I've been thinking about the future, about what happens to the house and the estate when you're gone. I know legally it all comes to me, but I want to make sure that's actually what you want." I took her hand, feeling grateful for her thoughtfulness and the genuine care behind the question. "Lucy, this house has become exactly what your father hoped it would be, a place where his love supports work that matters, where family means people who choose to care for each other. I can't think of anyone I'd rather have carrying on that legacy. I've been talking with David about setting up a foundation," she continued, "using the estate to support marine conservation research and education. Maybe establishing scholarships for students studying environmental science, making sure Dad's legacy keeps growing and helping people long after we're both gone." It was perfect. It was exactly what Daniel would have wanted his love and resources, supporting the protection of the natural world he'd cherished, helping young people build careers in environmental science, creating positive change that would outlast all of us. As I write this, 3 years after that terrifying day in the nursing home hallway, I'm sitting in my study surrounded by photos from Lucy's wedding to David, from the Marine Conservation Conference we hosted last month, from Frank's 70th birthday celebration, where his children and grandchildren met Lucy, and immediately understood why she'd become so important to me. The walls are covered with certificates of appreciation from environmental organizations, photos of research projects I've helped fund, letters from graduate students whose work I've supported. I'm not a victim anymore. I'm not even a survivor, really. I'm a woman who learned that her voice matters, her resources have power, and her family is defined by love and respect, rather than legal documents or biological connections. I'm someone who discovered that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property. It's the knowledge that you're strong enough to stand up for yourself, wise enough to recognize manipulation, and worthy of relationships built on truth rather than convenience. Jennifer thought she was stealing my inheritance when she manipulated me into that nursing home and tried to sell my house. Instead, she gave me the greatest gift possible, the understanding that I'm stronger than I knew, more capable than I'd been allowed to believe, and deserving of a life built on my own terms, rather than other people's expectations. She tried to erase me from my own story. Instead, she helped me write the best chapter of my life. And that's an inheritance that no one can steal, manipulate, or destroy, no matter how cleverly they plan, how sweetly they lie, or how thoroughly they underestimate the woman they're trying to exploit. The irony is exquisite. In trying to steal what she thought was my legacy, Jennifer helped me discover what my legacy actually islanded, not money or property, but the knowledge that dignity can't be taken away unless you give it up, that wisdom grows stronger under pressure, and that the most valuable things in life, love, respect, purpose, authentic relationships, are things that belong completely to you, beyond the reach of anyone who would try to steal them. That's the inheritance I'm most proud to leave behind. That's the legacy Jennifer, despite all her planning and manipulation, could never touch.